Action potential. It is rapidly developing membrane potential changes which rapidly travel over the membrane. Or the action potentials are electrochemical fluctuations in the membranes of excitable cells which rapidly propagate. Excitable cells are neurons and muscles. It is a signaling mechanism and where RMP is altered and converted into action potential in the excitable cell. For example, there is a cross section of the central spinal cord. There is a central process of the sensory neuron. This is a central process which is connected with the spinal cord, and the peripheral process, which is here I've shown. There is a sodium potassium ATPase pump, potassium leaky pumps, and mechanical sensitive sodium channels or touch sensitive sodium channels, and voltage gated sodium channels, and voltage gated potassium channels. These are the important channels which play an important part in this action potential. For example, there's a resting neuron having the resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolt, but when we test the neuron, or, we give the stimulus to the neuron, there's distortion in the membrane, which causes the sodium influx through mechanical stimulus sensitive or touch sensitive sodium channels. This sodium influx response is not responsible for complete depolarization of the membrane. This is the main point. The subthreshold stimulus. Stimulus by which threshold potential is not achieved. It is a local potential. It is caused little as it causes little membrane potential fluctuation because stimulus is not strong enough to reach the threshold potential. So it cannot move on the membrane, it cannot produce action potential and dies out. When we touch the neuron, there is distortion in the membrane which causes sodium influx through the mechanical stimulus sensitive sodium channels. As the stimulus is not strong enough to reach the threshold potential, it causes little sodium influx which causes membrane little depolarization of the membrane. But due to the weak stimulus, it cannot reach the threshold potential and potential dies out, and membrane becomes repolarized and achieves resting membrane potential due to the additional leakage of potassium through potassium leaky channels. Potassium is normally leaking out. It is as the membrane is permeable, so potassium continuously leaks out through the potassium leaky channels. But additional potassium leaks out due to the sodium influx. If 10 sodium if 10 sodium came in and membrane slightly depolarized, so the 10 potassium will leak out, so the 10 sodium influx will result in the 10 potassium efflux. So when the action potential actually occurs, when we apply stimulus to a part of the membrane which is strong enough to cause enough distortion in the membrane that required sodium influx through the mechanical stimulus sensitive sodium channels, and resting membrane potential fluctuate through this inward current up to threshold potential. As soon as that part of the membrane achieves threshold potential, millions and millions of voltage gate sodium channels open and their activation gate. When a lot of sodium comes in and threshold potential rapidly tries to reach the equilibrium potential of sodium, which is plus 65 millivolt. During this process, membrane becomes less and less negative, and eventually negative polarity of the membrane is completely lost and the membrane becomes depolarized, and it may produce a little overshoot, but before the equilibrium potential of sodium could be achieved, the inward current uh, sodium influx stops by the closure of inactivation gate of the voltage gated sodium channels. The outward current starts by potassium efflux through voltage gated potassium channels. As more and more potassium goes out, the membrane gets more and more electronegative, gaining back its negative polarity, becoming repolarized. Resting membrane resting membrane reaches the threshold potential, becomes depolarized, and so because of sodium influx and because of potassium efflux, it becomes again repolarized. And when it reaches the resting membrane potential, potassium channels remain open for a short time. They are sluggish. Membrane becomes more and more negative than the resting membrane potential. Membrane becomes hyperpolarized. This hyperpolarization below the resting membrane potential. Voltage gated potassium channels are closed, and then the resting membrane potential is achieved back. This is a voltage gated sodium channel. At resting membrane potential, its activation gate is open and activation gate is closed. But when threshold potential is achieved, the activation gate opens and the inactivation gate tries to close. Activation gate opens faster than the inactivation gate closes. But when the high peak is achieved, when the membrane is depolarized, the inactivation gate closes and the activation gate remains open. This is the inactive state, which is not excitable. No matter what action potential generated, this is inactive state. This cannot, in this state, action potential cannot be generated as the sodium influx cannot occur and the membrane cannot depolarize. So no matter what you do, once the action potential ends, once the action potential is generated and the inactive states are back to its resting states, back to its excitable state, only then the action potential is generated again. One action potential ends, then another starts. Here is the local potential, where resting membrane potential reaches the threshold potential by enough stimulus and enough sodium influx. Then the voltage gated sodium channel opens and make the membrane depolarize. And when it reaches a certain point, then the voltage gated sodium channels close and voltage gated potassium channels open, and it reaches to the resting membrane potential and becomes repolarized, but it cannot close at the resting membrane potential, so it becomes hyperpolarized. When they close, the membrane is back to resting membrane potential. This is local potential, where the resting membrane potential reaches the threshold potential by the sodium influx due to the mechanical sensitive stimulus sodium channels. And then the voltage gated sodium channels started and causes the sodium influx, which results in depolarization. And then it reaches a certain point and the voltage gated sodium channels close and potassium start efflux through voltage gated potassium channels, and the membrane reaches the resting membrane potential, but it cannot the voltage gated potassium channels are sluggish and the membrane becomes, this is repolarization, and this, when the membrane exceeds the resting membrane potential, it is hyperpolarization. And then when the potassium voltage gated potassium channels are closed, the membrane gains back its resting membrane potential. Known as the at rest and stimulus is given, it achieves the threshold potential and local potential, which is caused by the sodium influx through mechanical stimulus sensitive sodium channels or touch sensitive sodium channels. Then the depolarization starts through the sodium influx through the voltage gated sodium channels. When peak achieves, the repolarization occurs through potassium efflux through voltage gated potassium channels. And then it exceeds resting membrane potential through because the channels are sluggish and cannot close at time at the resting membrane potential, so the hyperpolarization occurs. And then when the channels are closed, potassium voltage gated potassium channels are closed, the membrane achieves its resting membrane potential again. What is the difference between local potential and the action potential? Local potential is non-propagating and action potential propagates along the membrane. It is and local potential is graded. It depends on the stimulus. If there is strong stimulus to reach the threshold potential, and if the stimulus is low, so it cannot reach the threshold potential and machine tells out. So it depends upon the stimulus, amount of stimulus, how strong the stimulus is. But the action potential always stereotypical. It has always the same magnitude, no matter how strong the stimulus is. It will always be the same. It will always be identical and it is not graded. Whereas local potential can be graded, and local potential shows the phenomena of the summation. If there is a local potential of this much, and before it dies out, there's another stimulus, and then the local potential aid up and can reach the threshold potential. But in case of the action potential, once the action potential is started, no matter how much strong you stimulus give, once the action potential will end, then another action potential will take place. Action potential is time and voltage dependent. It requires enough voltage to start and enough time to complete one action potential, then the another is generated. There is massive tissue damage, for example, in the crush injury or burns, or there is renal failure, the hyperkalemia occurs. When there is increase in potassium concentration, extracellularly, potassium present inside the cell will not leak out through the leaky channels through the concentration because of the concentration gradient, making the cell slightly depolarized and making resting membrane potential chronically near the threshold potential, which results in the dysfunction of the voltage gated sodium channels as they are trapped into the inactive state, resulting in difficulty in exciting the hyperkalemia state of accommodation is achieved by the excitable cells because the voltage gated sodium channels are trapped in this position where the activation gate and inactivation gate both are closed because of the resting membrane potential being the chronically near the threshold potential is affecting the velocity of action potential. Diameter. There is more resistance and the narrow diameter, so it results in the slow velocity, whereas there is fast velocity in the wide diameter, and because there is less resistance. And the myelination, the myelinated axon is a fast conductor. It is saltatory conduction. Saltatory conduction is an electrical impulse which skips from node to node down the full length of the axon, whereas the unmyelinated axon is a slow conductor. Here's the unmyelinated axon. When we give the stimulus, there is sodium influx, and when the threshold is achieved, the voltage gated sodium channels open and the depolarization occurs. It reaches peak, and potassium efflux causes the repolarization of the membrane, and depolarization and repolarization and depolarization and repolarization occurs. Whereas in the myelinated axon, these cells which myelinate the peripheral nerves are the Schwann cells, and between these Schwann cells there is an area which is known as node of Frenebel. So when there is a stimulus, the depolarization and repolarization occurs. Sodium moves across this center axon, and when there is the unmyelinated area, the node of Frenebel, there the demyelination and depolarization and repolarization occurs. Then the sodium moves, and the depolarization and repolarization occurs, and the sodium moves. So this is fast as compared to this, where there is repolarization and depolarization at every point. This is the fast conductor. So the well myelinated axon is a fast conductor, and when the action potential is generated, the one axon communicates with another axon through these chemical messengers. There is a ligand-gated voltage-gated channels. When these messengers bind to that, they can be acetylcholine or anodes. So there is a ligand-gated ligand-gated channels. This binds to that ligand, and there is the channel that starts working, and the sodium influx occurs, and the potassium influx, and this continues depolarization and repolarization in another axon until it reaches the brain central nervous system.